I'm not much of a Greek mythology guy, but even I know the story of Icarus. No, I'm not talking about Kid Icarus, though I absolutely adored that game during the NES era, and obviously it's related. But here, I'm referring to Icarus, the son of the craftsman Daedalus. In the myth, Daedalus constructs a labyrinth, which he himself ultimately gets trapped in alongside his boy. To escape, he ingeniously concocts 2 sets of wings for he and his son, but there's a massive problem. The wings are made of metal, leather, and most importantly, wax. Knowing that his young child would be overcome with the excitement of flight, Daedalus issued Icarus a strong warning. Fly low and carefully and survive to see another day. But Icarus didn't listen. He flew higher and higher, more and more enraptured by the allure of his immediate circumstances. Thus, what Daedalus feared came to pass. Icarus's wings melt, and he falls into the water below, drowning soon thereafter. The idiom we use today to check people on their inherent ambition and even greed, flying too close to the sun, hails from this ancient myth, and it perfectly describes what Microsoft has done with Xbox, which is very much now a third-party brand with a console nebulously attached to it. Like Icarus's handcrafted wings, Microsoft tenuously crafted an escape for its beleaguered ecosystem, but it got way too greedy, and now it's dealing with the fallout, tethered to an increasingly irrelevant console, a completely flatlined subscription service that itself has negatively altered its own audience's spending habits, and forcing it into the realm of third-party publishers, just so it can monetarily support its sprawling network of developers, publishers, and games that it has no hope of recouping the cost of in its own space. It's quite the fall from grace, and if you look up and squint, you may see Icarus silhouetted against the sun, flailing as he drops, or maybe that's Phil Spencer and Matt Booty. Who knows? Before this video goes any further though, I do want to be clear. Until this generation of consoles, I think Xbox's presence on the market wasn't only competitive, but fueled by a lot of really great decisions that helped bend the arc of gaming history towards some really laudable end goals. Some of you might be too young or too new to gaming to remember, but when the original Xbox launched in the fall of 2001 and it only came with an Ethernet port for online play, a lot of people thought that was insane, and for the moment it released into, it kind of was. Fresh on the back of a phone line connected Dreamcast and a PlayStation 2 with an external modem that, at least initially, supported low bandwidth play. But Microsoft knew better than anyone, and certainly better than its competitors, the direction high-speed internet was inevitably going. Something you can read about for yourself in Bill Gates' prescient 1995 book, A Road Ahead, which I read way back in high school for some reason. Xbox Live, launched in 2002, was in and of itself a self-contained revolution that set the predicate for online play. And by the time Xbox 360 came to market in 2005, Xbox was again ahead of the curve with digital purchases, achievements, and lots of other things we take for granted today. When it comes to services and ingenuity, Microsoft hasn't only provided a net positive to the wider gaming space, but shepherded forward a new way of looking at console gaming. When I bought my own Xbox in 2003, for KOTOR of course, trapped in my Star Wars nerddom as I was in those days, it felt new, advanced, and different. We take it for granted today, but unless you were erasing shit from your memory card or playing an audio CD or later a DVD, you simply didn't turn on your console without a game in it. We have Xbox to thank for making gaming consoles into true multimedia machines, and I don't mean that facetiously. They led the charge there, innovating and differentiating themselves from their competition. They played a major role in further mainstreaming consoles. But the reality is that Xbox never really found its way out of the wilderness all console manufacturing inherently begins in. And even in its lone strong generation from a sales and market penetration perspective, the Xbox 360 era, it still came in last place when compared to its contemporaries in the form of PlayStation 3 and Nintendo's Wii, which both outsold it, each doing so with a year less time on the market. A lot of this, unsurprisingly, has to do with games, which will get us to where we sit with Xbox today. And for a while, Xbox had its own run of really high-quality exclusive offerings from both first and second party, not to mention the copious third-party timed and permanent exclusives it courted, something Xbox and many of its fans are mighty critical of today, but which it pursued arguably more zealously than any hardware manufacturer ever at one point in its history. Think Mass Effect, BioShock, and Dead Rising as key examples. The original Xbox was known for Halo and later on the first Forza racer. Xbox 360 threw Gears of War into the mix, still with more Halo and Forza, then Xbox One with, well, Halo, Gears of War, and Forza, and today we have Halo, Gears of War, and Forza, and a hell of a lot more too thanks to studio and publisher purchases over the last 5 years. But now it doesn't really matter, because PlayStation and Nintendo will also have Halo, Gears of War, and Forza, and all of the other stuff too, thus relegating the Xbox brand to Sega status, which is undeniably great for the bottom line, but frankly ominous at best if you're ingratiated in that ecosystem. Now, I'm a 40-year-old man, and mentally I'm more like 75, so I really shouldn't be using terminology like this. But this entire meltdown has created an enormous amount of what the kids today call cope within facets of the Xbox fanbase. And we're going to get into all of that too, but for now, let's stay focused on just what went wrong, and how Xbox flew too close to that darn stubborn star our planet is hurtling around. As I assume you already know well enough, Xbox's fortunes started changing markedly in 2013, just as soon as Microsoft revealed their Xbox One console that spring, and it's fair to say that they never really regained a foothold from that point on. The Xbox 360 generation, it turned out, was a complete mirage, and they've been chasing that high ever since. Much has been made in the years that have elapsed about just what went wrong, but it's fair to say that the situation presented a sort of death by 1,000 cuts. Especially surprising since PlayStation 3 itself had Sony's gaming vertical on the ropes in its first couple of years on the market. Microsoft could have vanquished Sony from this space, but they failed to do so, and a major reason was games. But it was also a presentational issue and ironically a services issue, something Xbox hadn't whiffed on very much in previous generations. For starters, and we won't linger too long here because it's a frankly very boring topic at this point, the entire idea of centering your console in your life and watching TV, sports, and so on via it wasn't a bad one. Xbox One, like say OnLive before it or Google's Stadia since, arrived at obvious conclusions, but their timing was all wrong. I watch Jets games through YouTube on my PS5. I watch Islanders games through ESPN Plus on my PS5. I stream TV and movies through apps on my PS5. Now, some might say a smart TV can do all of that, and they're right, but that's entirely my point. The TV Call of Duty sports shit that everyone made fun of doesn't actually seem so insane in hindsight. It's just that timing is everything. Hell, Sega was giving people digital access to games literally 30 years ago on the Sega Channel. Fighting and sports players were playing SNES and Genesis games online with X-Band in 1994, and so on. Let's not forget that if Xerox had any foresight, they would have dominated the home computer industry with the technologies that they didn't care about or understand, but very much invented. You know, the mouse, the GUI, Ethernet, the laser printer, those little chestnuts. What I'm saying is that timing and foresight is the whole equation. Sometimes you win, but oftentimes you lose. Many times, losing is your own fault. That's life. Now, I can hear you screaming through your screens, what about the game sharing thing? Surely that helped kill Xbox as we knew it too. In the short term, there's no doubt that's true. The Shuhei Yoshida Adam Boyes video is perhaps the single most legendary E3 moment in the history of the now-defunct trade show.
This is how you share your games on PS4. Thanks.
PlayStation.
And it constituted the biggest punch in the face one console manufacturer had delivered to another since PlayStation undid Sega's console business once and for all at the turn of the century.
$2.99.
But I'd argue that as much as that hurt, and as much as the TV sports Call of Duty thing injured the brand too, all of it could have been made better if only the console had some killer games on it. And the reality is, this is where Xbox truly botched things, and why they never really recovered.
Oh, botch! I botched that one. Oh, that's a botch job.
Bad messaging can be overcome, and some bad experiences can too. The PS3 launched with a digital storefront running on a browser, for God's sake. Its controller was a hollow version of its previous gen controller because it abandoned its new design too late in the process to make something fresh. The PlayStation Network was catastrophically hacked and went down for weeks in 2011. But Sony realized something absolutely vital that Microsoft never quite grasped. Great games can fix just about anything. Without them, the machines would flounder, but with those games, with a catalog that keeps people fixated, engaged, and playing, all could be made right again. Sony's ability to capture people with the PlayStation 4 in particular, all the while Xbox One languished, really does matter. It forced Xbox to make some bold decisions to survive, no doubt. We'll finally get into all of that shortly, but I'd say a blatant over-reliance on the aforementioned Halo, Gears, and Forza trifecta hurt a great deal too. Sony knows how to move on, or at least it did. That's how Naughty Dog went from Crash Bandicoot to Jak and Daxter to Uncharted to The Last of Us to Intergalactic, or how Sucker Punch went from Sly Cooper to Infamous to Ghost, and so many other examples. You get the idea. You don't think there could be 15 Uncharted games by now? Trust me when I say there certainly could be. But then you look at the other side. Halo, Gears, and Forza. And Halo, Gears, and Forza. And Halo, Gears, and Forza is only going to get you so far. You need to do way more. There's no doubt that Microsoft identified this problem and acted. Indeed, it's how their flight towards the sun began in the first place. To solve their games problem, Microsoft did a few things. For starters, they continued to aggressively court timed and outright third-party exclusives, The thing that's very much not okay unless they do it. So you got the likes of the original Titanfall, and you got Rise of the Tomb Raider and the marketing hullabaloo that circulated around that too. At some point though, Microsoft realized it needed to beef up its first-party presence in particular, which during this early to mid Xbox One generation was woefully underperforming compared to its rivals. You had the Coalition, founded in 2010 to shepherd the Gears of War franchise that Microsoft ultimately purchased from Epic, its original developer. You had Rare, which at this point was a shadow of a shadow of a shadow of its former Nintendo-owned self, though they've since emerged as a vital piece of Xbox's publishing equation. You had Lionhead, a vanity purchase for Microsoft that cratered for years before finally going away in 2016, 6 years after it released Fable 3, its final AAA release. Ensemble Studios delivered Halo Wars before being unceremoniously shuttered in 2009, and way back in 2007, Microsoft let Bungie walk away for some reason. I mean, it was truly dire. Other than Mojang, the studio behind Minecraft, and a truly ingenious purchase by Microsoft, which happened in 2014, Xbox's first-party offerings barely existed during this period. By 2018, though, all of that changed. Microsoft began to take flight, doing what it had to do without nearly flying too close to the sun. Indeed, the moves they were to make seemed like exactly what the doctor ordered, and you certainly can't argue with at least some of them. You could easily make a case for all of them. The powers that be realize that Microsoft is far from an inherently creative company, and it's unlikely they'd be able to overcome the gap in quality games comparable to Nintendo or Sony without lots of outside help, which they aggressively sought. But these moves also made the sun that much hotter. At E3 in 2018, Microsoft made a huge splash when it announced the purchase of a variety of seemingly random third-party developers, the keywords being seemingly random, we'll get back to that would help build Xbox's badly languishing first-party family into something more respectable. Some of these purchases were totally sensible. For instance, Xbox brought in-house 2 second parties that fit their approach perfectly, in the form of Forza Horizon dev Playground Games and State of Decay dev Undead Labs. These guys already delivered for Xbox, so putting a ring on it is great. More mysteriously, perhaps, they purchased Compulsion Games, which, as I write and record this, is on the precipice of releasing its first Xbox game all of these years later in the form of South of Midnight. They also snagged maybe the biggest head-scratcher of them all in the form of Ninja Theory, which makes beautiful games, no doubt, but as we saw with Hellblade 2 last year, no one really cares. By the next year, 2019, Microsoft had already invested in RPG studio Obsidian, arguably their smartest choice and to this day their most prolific, Insomniac-like churner of product, as well as the eclectic team Double Fine, which itself hasn't brought a game from embryo to market under Xbox's tutelage, at least not yet. The point here is that they were beefing up, even founding a couple of teams from scratch during this time. The incredibly productive RTS studio World's Edge, and the shockingly incompetent The Initiative, which is now on its 8th calendar year with no launch. Yet even these moves weren't enough, because Microsoft made another decision this time around that would force them to up the ante even further. Having a PlayStation-sized first-party family, which is what they had around 2019, would still be woefully inadequate to feed Game Pass, and it's Game Pass ultimately that brings us to where we are today. Now, if I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. Microsoft actually made a sensible and potentially even smart decision by spooling Game Pass up back in 2017, especially if you're examining the move through the lens of the time. It realized it was losing badly on the console market, unable to court adequate numbers of new players to the space based on old rules, so they tried to change the rules. And who could blame them? In their position at the time, I would have championed a similar approach, particularly with the runaway success of other subscription and streaming services that took parallel media silos, think TV, movies, and music, and turn those spaces upside down. Why would video games be immune to this trend? As we know now being the operative word, the reality is that most people have no interest whatsoever in a wide-ranging gaming sub, because unlike the churning nature of film, TV, and especially music, people spend way too much time with individual games for a broad subscription to make any sense to an enormous number of potential customers. But that was unknown, and perhaps even unknowable, back in 2017. We had no data, so they made the leap, and it seemed logical enough. But the reality is that a subscription service like that needs lots and lots of content, and though you can go and license it, it would likely be more efficient to simply make as many of the games as you could on your own. This is something virtually all of the streaming services and other entertainment silos outside of music have since learned. By 2020, Xbox Game Studios was in a more powerful position than ever before, but again, they weren't trying to sell games a la carte. They needed a constant stream of content to keep people engaged in their subscription on a monthly basis, so they had to go even deeper. At this point, Icarus wasn't flying too close to the sun at all, but his altitude was increasing. Remember, signing up to Game Pass for a couple of months to play, say, Starfield is a bad financial proposition for Microsoft, full stop. They just made, say, $40 max on you, but they would have made $70 if you just bought it. They need you to stay put, or the entire notion of Game Pass unravels. They needed more. Thus, near the end of 2020, Microsoft revealed that they weren't going to purchase individual studios, but rather entire publishers. This brings ZeniMax into the fold, which we lovingly refer to as Bethesda, the publisher, not to be confused with its flagship developer, which we also call Bethesda. This was a seismic move that ultimately cost Microsoft more than $8 billion, making it by far the largest M&A deal in the history of the console games industry at the time, and outside of its purchase of Skype and LinkedIn, the biggest deal Microsoft itself had ever made also at that time. Keep that factoid in mind for use later, it's important. Buying Bethesda and its legion of well-respected studios, key amongst them Doom developer id Software, Wolfenstein team Machine Games, and Dishonored dev Arcane, not to mention Western RPG powerhouse Bethesda Game Studios itself, would further help lubricate the wheels of commerce on Game Pass and premise. And again, this wasn't a horrible idea on paper. It's just that there are two really important pieces of the puzzle that Microsoft and its C-suite didn't quite anticipate. That owning all of these resources is very expensive and thus very risky in a walled garden, and that spending all this money would undoubtedly bring company-wide attention to the Xbox vertical in ways the brand never had to grapple with before. Remember, for many years, Xbox was such an insignificant part of Microsoft's business that it basically amounted to a rounding error. Since money in was never amazing, and since money out was never that concerning either, no one really paid attention to what Xbox was doing internally. Investors couldn't care less either. But all of that would begin to change with the Bethesda purchase, and as we'll find out a little later in this video, the pressure would be heightened even further by orders of magnitude. Icarus's wings weren't quite melting at this point, but he sure was starting to warm up. At the point Microsoft purchased Bethesda, it was fairly clear that virtually any entity in gaming was on the table for acquisition, and indeed, mega embarrassing internal correspondence between Xbox executives makes it clear that they were looking to buy pretty much anything and anyone in the industry, which better puts into perspective the hodgepodge of teams they would buy beginning in 2018. There was absolutely no rhyme or reason to the moves outside of growth because indeed there was no rhyme or reason to the moves. They just wanted more. Game Pass was becoming an unwieldy beast and it needed to feed. Could Microsoft purchase Warner Brothers? It was certainly considered. Could they buy Sega? There was interest. Square Enix? They wanted that too. The reality is they were interested in everyone, audaciously enough even Nintendo itself. Remember, of course, that Microsoft tried to buy Nintendo outright in the years leading up to the original Xbox, a story told throughout time as Nintendo executives laughing the Microsoft suits out of the room. But they were going to try again on that front too. Phil Spencer himself, the head of Xbox for many years, noted it would be a so-called career moment for him if he were to snag Nintendo. Honestly, if you read the correspondence, you'd be hard-pressed to find a gaming developer or publisher of any consequence not in Microsoft sights. It was at this point that I, personally, as an analyst, industry expert, and player of games, had alarms going off in my head. These dudes had absolutely no plan outside of growth. They had no strategy. They didn't know what they were doing. Xbox Studios head Matt Booty was sending emails noting that they could spend their competition out of business like that was a viable tactic and not instead an utterly embarrassing admission. If buying the likes of Ninja Theory was weird in 2018, and it certainly was, then finding the logic behind, say, Microsoft owning Paradox or CD Projekt would also be elusive, when their success and the success of all of these other companies was largely predicated on a spreadshot approach. It's why Sony never purchased studios it didn't work with first, and when it did, like say Bungie or Firewalk, it didn't work out very well, did it? Growth for growth's sake is simply not a viable option in creative fields, especially not in an Xbox ecosystem that was stagnant at best and shrinking at worst. But it's nonetheless an option that Xbox execs pursued with glee and passion, not knowing at the time that the zeal in which they wanted to pursue acquisitions would undo their entire operation as it was then understood, alienate large swaths of their fanbase, and force them into becoming a third-party publisher of games full stop, to everyone's benefit but their own players. Just before, I told you that Microsoft's Xbox brand was bringing the Eye of Sauron, or perhaps the Eye of Satya, on itself more and more with each passing quarter, but $8 billion on ZeniMax was nothing compared to what these guys were cooking up next. And if Icarus was feeling a little hot then, the wax would start dripping to the ground below after this next one. The move of all moves, my friends, was Microsoft's pursuit and ultimate acquisition of Activision Blizzard King. In early 2022, Microsoft revealed that it would purchase the mega publisher behind Call of Duty for a staggering $68.7 billion, some 8.5 times what it spent on Bethesda, a blatantly vast overpay for the entity, but one made as a seeming last-ditch effort to boost Game Pass and further monopolize console gaming resources. And it's fair to say that if you care about the Xbox console brand, this deal absolutely blew up in everyone's faces, and it did so a lot sooner than anyone could have thought possible. The deal, which closed in late 2023, almost immediately undid Microsoft's entire pursuit of exclusivity for its console ecosystem and for Game Pass, overpromising and underdelivering, all the while ensuring that the wider Microsoft entity would very much be paying attention to what Xbox was doing internally, upping the drama. Microsoft spent nearly 3 times more on Activision Blizzard King than the company had ever spent on a single acquisition in its history. And obviously the bean counters were going to be very, very, very interested in how all of this money would be made back. Little did anyone expect that much of the money would be made back by selling not only Activision Blizzard games and not only Bethesda games, but ultimately Xbox Studios games on its competitors' platforms. And that's how we arrive to today, with a totally reformed and reshaped Xbox that is now the biggest publisher on its prime competitor's platform. It's unbelievable. The reality is this: Game Pass is a wildly unsustainable and even destructive product when you consider how it eroded other parts of Xbox's business. If you're putting Call of Duty on Game Pass, a major promise behind the deal with the FTC to get this thing across the finish line, you simply cannot make back that series' insane level of cost by selling Game Pass subscriptions to transient subs for a fraction of what it would cost to just buy the game new. Microsoft no doubt started learning this in the years leading up to the deal, in which fewer and fewer third parties showed any interest in launching games into Game Pass on the back of ever-diminishing returns, while Xbox taught its own audience not to buy games, but rather subscribe to a service that would give them away at a reasonable monthly fee. Game Pass is a wonderful pro-consumer idea, no doubt, but the numbers don't add up. And you can just look at Microsoft's recent financials for yourself, wherein, without the Activision deal and the numbers that it added to the bottom line, Xbox's games business would actually be shrinking, which I don't need to tell you is a catastrophic situation for any consumer brand. It's a great idea to buy Bethesda and put Starfield on Game Pass, but how much more could have been made if it was merely sold a la carte? We'll find out when it comes to PlayStation 5 and Nintendo Switch 2, but the numbers speak for themselves. And this is something that internally, Microsoft executives really understood and even forewarned about, which is likely why other entities seem to be controlling Xbox now, with a series of executive figureheads carrying out directives they didn't and likely still don't believe in. It's clear that Phil Spencer and his team have tenuous at best control over the enterprise at this point, contradicting years of messaging and marketing to go in an entirely different direction. This was the moment that Microsoft flew too close to the sun. And in its own hubris, it ate more than it needed to. Its eyes were bigger than its stomach. It will now forever rely upon its competitors on the market to support and sustain its own gaming operation. It's a true fall from grace, one the industry very rarely sees, and ironically, these were moves that were cheered on by the biggest Xbox evangelists, adding extra layers to the drama. None of this would have happened if the Activision deal in particular didn't occur. The situation Xbox is now in has everything to do with it, perhaps foreshadowed by the Bethesda deal, but really pushed over the edge by Activision Blizzard King. We all learn in life to be careful what we wish for, and it's safe to say that a grouping of the loudest Xbox fans got just that. It's here that I want to begin to wrap things up, returning to my conspicuous use of the word cope earlier in the video, a word that old men like me really shouldn't be saying, but sometimes the thesaurus just doesn't do the needed vocabulary sufficient justice. 2025 marks my 23rd year in the games industry as a so-called professional, so I have a lot of experience here. I've been around the block a few times at this point. The loud, boisterous section of the Xbox ecosystem that has for years poisoned the well of console gaming discourse is the very group that most loudly cheered on these acquisitions, thinking that it would make Xbox into an exclusives churning machine unlike any you've ever seen, injuring its competitors in the process. And in a perfect world with good management and truly talented studios across the board, maybe that would have become reality. But these people were, and I want to emphasize this as much as I can, dead wrong. About as wrong as they could be. They were wrong repeatedly, unapologetically, aggressively, and consistently. Hearing things now like, this is great, everyone will subsidize Game Pass, is pure cope. And why would Game Pass need to be subsidized in the first place? Because it's ultimately not working as is? You don't say. Saying more people get these games is true, but also cope. This isn't what many of you were saying just a year ago, and certainly not 2 or 3 or more years before that, when you were rooting, praying, and hoping for games, series, publishers, and developers to be taken away from competing ecosystems. Fast forward to today, and PlayStation and Nintendo gamers get Xbox games. Xbox gamers get virtually nothing in return. How is that a win? Yes, Microsoft Gaming is now a massive third-party publisher, but that's not what you wanted, is it? They're making a lot of money, yes, but they're spreading the field elsewhere and not staying put. More cope? You decide. The point I'm making is this. We're all wrong. I'm wrong all the time. I've spoken into a microphone for maybe 10,000 hours or more. I've written millions of words quite literally. I made a really dumb Mass Effect 3 video once and I said Vita would outsell 3DS. But I own those mistakes and many others. We talk about all of it extensively on our shows. We literally start every episode of Sacred Symbols with corrections from the previous week. Will we see any similar adjustments from the chronically wrong here? I highly doubt it, but it's something that maybe I'll get into in a future video. It's just that it's not every day that Icarus flies too close to the sun hand in hand with someone leading him there, blissfully unaware of the outcome, when the outcome seemed at some point so blatantly obvious. How did I know for years that this would all go pear-shaped, but they didn't? Where does the buck stop with these people? Why does anyone continue to listen to them? I guess that's up to all of you. So yeah, that's how Microsoft undid the Xbox brand, paradoxically making it more financially powerful while undoing its entire exclusive ecosystem forevermore. And aggressively trying to undermine Nintendo and specifically PlayStation by attempting to remove as many resources from the board as possible to squeeze the competition. Microsoft instead made itself into PlayStation's biggest third-party publisher, from Call of Duty to Minecraft, from everything Bethesda does to everything Xbox Studios does. This perhaps constitutes one of the great ironies in all of gaming's long history. And it's all because some executives that thought they knew more than everyone else insisted on flying too close to the sun, bringing the entire operation careening into the plasma, hand in hand.